Hello everyone, today we talk about a controversial topic that should not actually be controversial at all. That is to say, a more traditional understanding of Spartan warfare. You know that in the last years, and especially in the YouTube community, there's been a great wave of alleged myth-busting stemming from this sort of pseudo-puritanically righteous and self-entitled attitude towards basically anything that is, oh my god, they told you it was in a way, but it was actually in another. Like those kind of things presented, by the way, in very often superficial ways. You know that on Schwerpunkt we have a pretty sound ambition of covering in an encyclopedical fashion the entire history of warfare, and in quite some greater depth than what you normally see on YouTube. I've already made some video commentaries of other channels, especially the bigger ones that sort of profit quite highly from this sort of myth-busting thing, which is at least a more nuanced topic, or at least it should be treated, especially in front of the masses that eventually are going to be informed by such ideas, even though you can argue that we're probably on the brink of some major neurocognitive collapse that we're already witnessing among the younger generations at traumatically accelerating rate, where all this information will essentially be worthless, and that essentially videos like this are mostly, clicked on because they're cheaply and superficially consumed. And so they, while, sort of fueling the worst ideas, they somehow pile them up in a giant mine of the same, without significantly altering the root cause of all this general the back of world education, individual consistency, like cultural development, and more. In fact, I don't want to be too critical in a video like this. There are some topics which unavoidably end up doing so, right? Even talking just classical Hellenic warfare in general, you must always make these disclaimers explaining how much, let's say, even in a rhetorical and dialectical way, the hoplitic heresy has been overblown in the opposite direction that it was meant to also criticize, right? And the bottom line, because we've seen it in other videos about Hellenic hoplites, etc., is that it's not like certain academic intuitions weren't wrong, but they were incredibly parochial, provincial academic intuitions that at some point also in the broader West were just not even taken into consideration, made by people who were actually not specialists in the art of war. They mostly lean towards sort of a materialistic archaeological mindset. And since there is an enormous amount of self-referentiality, especially in a certain part of the Western academia, this was essentially sold still as some sort. It's just like the so-called infantry or military revolution. You find eventually the same scholars who essentially embraced this theory at some point, becoming famous for criticizing their own theory. And so basically, if you think about it, wasting an enormous amount of time in between, making, first of all, people believe that that's an actual academic issue. And secondly, in fact, distracting the followers in that regard from the most sort of morally and scientifically objective realization that most of the academia didn't even care about this to begin with, and they had some broader military historical expertise and art of war sort of built up that was completely immune to this nonsense. Unfortunately, people tend to follow this sensationalism, fireworks, all these terminologies. Just think how, certain words are, I don't want to make specific, but think about the concept of flexibility, geopolitics. 99% of the time you hear this, the person that uses this word does not even understand what they actually mean or what they're actually supposed to explain in providing this, in fact, evasive, elusive explanations about very big sort of overall topics that at the end of the day are not even requiring, not maybe the term, I personally detest the term geopolitics because it in fact is using an Occamian razor, useless, right? There is just politics. It's useless to specify it's geopolitics that very often comes with, if it were just considering, world politics, but well, how many other politics do you know if you want to bring it at a higher level? But in fact, very much employed together with this, in fact, deterministic idea that there are certain geographical areas that produce certain powers, and that's their sphere of influence, and that's how it must be. Basically, reducing any Clausewitzian understanding of the fluidity of politics and war as a struggle between moral forces that continually, influence one another. There were never blocks. Even during the Cold War, there was always some kind of, not even heretical, but sort of, I can't even say the term natural and physiological, because in fact there's naturalistic terminology is very dangerous when applied to politics as well, because it works in a completely different way. But you understand the gist of what I'm saying. That there is this ease in finding simple explanation or wishfully thinking, pretending to use a word to explain a system that you haven't even taken the time to browse it itself. I explained this in videos about, the Roman manipular legion versus the Hellenistic Macedonian phalanx. That's where I got the term flexibility from. The Roman legion was more you know that tendentially I favor Romanity for different reasons, but if you say the Romans won because they were more flexible, per se doesn't mean anything. It's not actually descriptive of the concrete military reality. Other thing, you don't know the reality on the ground. Yes, because you are there, in war, telling us, especially from a trench perspective, what is going on all across the front. Yeah, sure. And there are literally ever more people who actually think, people who we treat as supposedly fully developed human beings that take this as sort of kind of basic phraseological pseudo-wisdom, right? At least they don't know it's pseudo, but still, right? And the reason why I got to this point with the Spartans is also is specific, quite specific, because when we talk about the Spartan exception, we shouldn't indulge in Spartan exceptionalism. We shouldn't, in other words, overblow differences, whatever. And this can easily apply to the entire classical Hellenic warfare, right? There is no doubt that this word was tendentially more sort of gentrifying, more modernizing, secularizing. This is something we have seen also in the video about the rise and fall of the Hellenic civilization through an Indo-European lens, right? However, when you actually look at military systems in antiquity, you realize that they were all much more symmetrical in relation with one another than we actually think. Provided that war is always asymmetrical by definition, other term, asymmetrical, perfect. People think that there is such thing like asymmetrical and symmetrical warfare. Yeah, because warfare is notoriously like identical things clashing against one another, zeroing as a result. Yeah, exact. Warfare is by definition always asymmetrical. They can't tend toward, there are systems, as I was saying just here, that tend towards symmetry, as definitely the bigger the sides are. However, this is exactly the point. When you look at antiquity, there is a much greater similarity between communities than, but you can see it, like in this case, across the Mediterranean, the Levant, Europe, then we normally realize. When I started Schwerpunkt, for example, I had a broader idea of Hellenic exceptionalism, meaning, the Greeks fundamentally thought in a completely different way from everybody else, or at least in a way that is worth singling out for specific reasons. And I realized that at the end of the day, everything looked much more similar than, and it was actually much more similar than we tend to think. This applies to Sparta as well. However, if any difference existed at the time, of course it was significant, right? If you consider the crop rate of the era and the technological development pace, sort of the capacity of surplus cumulating of general civilizational development, you realize that even minimal differences into today's 21st century eyes, obsessed with technology, for example, and a rampant technological development. How many times you have heard that, I don't know, the Hellenes won the Persian wars because they had, I don't know, more metal around. That's not what they did, right? Nor we should think, I never made a video about that, but that's an important one, that, for example, the Achaemenid army was inferior to the Hellenic one. If anything, the opposite was true. But you don't hear that very often, right? So there are just some fashionable topics that tend to make their way into people's minds, or in particular subcultural dimensions like YouTube can be. And the, say, accurate objectivity of why, for example, a system was different from one another, and why at the time it was a big deal, is somehow downplayed, as if there weren't. You see, differences are meaningful. There is meaning in this. These were political, military, social systems that very often are presented to us as some, again, predeterminedly advancing systems, such as the notion that Sparta was in a condition of perpetual decline, by the way, which was not true. The Spartans, if anybody had studied their 3rd, 2nd century BC warfare, for example, would know that they were actually, speaking actually of their military competence, the only, say, Hellenic, still polis-based system that managed to develop the system was akin to the Macedonian phalanx. The Athenians had nothing like this. And so allegedly the idea that the Spartans would have been also mentally inflexible and whatever is nonsense, right? There is sometimes a political, ideological take like the Spartans are the conservatives, the traditionalists of the situation, but it actually sucked because the lion's share during the Persian wars ultimately was made by the Athenians. At least their thalassocracy seems something more impressive to praise and whatever. And you know that we covered that. We made multiple videos also on the Athenian navy, also against the Spartan navy, because look at the Peloponnesian War, how many clashes we can reconstruct thanks to Thucydides that we've already uploaded lots of videos on. So it's obvious that, you see, I don't make this video because of the recent KNG thing that I confess I thought, okay, I shall criticize this too, but I don't like to make too many video commentaries because at the end of the day, I realized that people click on those videos just because, oh my God, of the drama, right? Look, this guy is, criticizing this big channel, so it's a big deal. Let's see what he says. And just missing the point. I prefer getting, obviously I would like to have more views, but let's say I prefer getting the views of those who are generally interested in the topic as opposed to some greater sort of emotional instability for which they need this, the crave for this kind of confrontation. If you listen to my videos, you will find plenty of criticism in general about all these ideas, except it takes work and time, which people are unwilling, of course, to spend at some point. Now, with the Spartans here, I'm sort of anticipating by bit, let's say, some of the main aspects that I think have been overblown in pretending that Sparta was just equal to any other Hellenic system, because or that this Spartan system was actually not performing, and that after all it was not even that important, is that it's all a myth, because like people believe this. Yeah, you can use the idea that there are myths and people believe in them, except you should get those right? And that's unfortunately what we tend not to do. So I've made other videos about the Spartans, including one about the Spartan hoplite, where I also made enough criticism, and all the other Hellenic hoplite politic warfare series to the aforementioned hoplitic heresy. That again, it's an incredibly uselessly self-referentially and narrowly overblown issue that does not deserve even anybody's attention, in my opinion. Especially because if you have really, say, studied classical literature, which takes some specific level of linguistic expertise and general background, no doubt, but it's something that, say, for single battles has more or less those couple of accounts from which we know anything, and that are, by the way, especially for classical Hellas, very insightful, right? We wish we had that for early Roman warfare, right? And that is, in and of itself, of course, a measure of these cultures' difference, and definitely the Hellenes, as we said before, were sort of less aggressive-minded than the Romans, but even in this we tend, and especially when you look at the Spartans, as they indeed were similar to the other, say to some degree homogeneous to the other Hellenic polis, how still sort of primitive and warlike the systems were, first of all, even down the line of, say, I don't know, the 5th century, when what we call properly the political system has fully matured. You see, there are people who say, you're falling yourself into the hoplite heresy. Just why? Because I am criticizing that, and I've always known that the 5th century BC was the moment in which what we call hoplitism reached its full maturity, and before things were slightly different. But what does that actually mean, right? Do you have a comparative understanding, for example, of the development of pre-orderly aligned battle lines in the history of warfare? Do you know what the Hellenic language defines as tactike or phalanx, for example, which was a term, by the way, applied also to basically any other people who had heavy infantry, and that had nothing to do, in fact, with the specific similarities, the specific characteristics, let's say, with properly Hellenic hoplitism. That was unique in its own regard. The degree, right, by which this is true is what actually substantiates that aforementioned historical objectivity and military historical accuracy. All right, if you just use these words as if you think that everything is an ideological struggle between bases that you don't even know anything about, because let's be honest, nobody reads anything anymore, even less, in primary sources, because someone decides that, I don't know, just reading books is a measure of education. Unfortunately, it's not, right? Reading books per se does not confer any kind of competence whatsoever, right? There is a huge difference between reading, learning, studying, understanding, researching. And of course, if you're not aware of what's the outcome of that as well, it's going to be very difficult to dislocate yourself among all these concepts in ways that, in fact, can be usefully spent, even just in a positive historical discourse. Most of the internet actually does reflect this. So today I'm making an effort to illustrate, it's a bet as well, on illustrating Spartan warfare along the lines that today basically no YouTuber would make anymore. At least there is a lot of course, of majority of AI sort of Spartan myth thing, the idea of 300s kind of, comic book vibe about the myth of the Spartans, which you see is taken as the monster. Like people are into it, but they say, people think that this was actually Sparta. Who does that? Maybe you. Like if you don't have any other sort of term of comparison, it's kind of obvious that the Spartans are different, but we're passing from, say, the comic art to, I don't know, Osprey images stolen to make Twitter posts, right? That's not really what confers an accurate depiction of Spartan history and society. Especially with that KNG video around that says things like, oh, look, also the Spartans had art. Well, I learned that in middle school. Like, it's literally something that you learn as a foundation of Hellenic history, that at some point back in the day, Athens had a more rigid, in fact, Spartan militaristic mentality than the Spartans themselves to a degree. And of course, there were arts and crafts in Sparta as well. And yeah, some people just treat these systems as monoliths, there is no doubt. But was in this sense the idea of Sparta, if you want the same myth of Sparta positively understood from an historical point of view, really wrong or unsubstantiated by historical or archaeological evidence? No, right? Unfortunately, I think that, again, especially AI seems to have taken over the scripts of bigger channels. So the AI works like this. I can tell you that it's not good, right? I can use it as a secretary, like, correct the mistakes in this text from a grammatical point of view, or write this formula, given this text, I don't know, making it more concise. You always need to reread it and you have to be sure that information is correct. But in general, the worst about that is not much the accuracy of what they can fish from, the AI can fish from the internet. The problem is that if you want to give if you want to really to give a certain impression or a certain topic, you can simply ask AIs to say go that direction, so to write a text that is biased according to your own bias, and bringing in anything that substantiates the that kind of vision, and so opposes another. This is not useful as well, especially considering that and you can see that while there is a historical research behind those scripts in the bigger channels, there is an evident flattening and sort of compaction for the format, right, that takes the precedence over the historical accuracy that very often is also demanded from people that are not that expert or that good, right? The fact that you're a historian doesn't mean that you understand much how an Hellenic phalanx actually fought. Because everybody has an idea of how that happens, of course. And again, it's fine as long as it's an accurate idea, as long as you have reconstructed battle after battle. If you have a general idea of how other peoples around fought, if you just know, well, the history behind that. We are treating ourselves in a ridiculous fashion where everybody knows that basically you're lying, but they're going on board with that just for the sake of what? Of conversation and socializing. Who cares about that? Here we're telling history, and we have to be as objective and straightforward as possible. So there are different ways, again, you can approach this topic, and really today I want to stick to the most traditional version of, and traditional, which means historical and accurate, right? Because that's what tradition is all about, also for the same Spartans that are informed by that, because we will see this better in some videos about the Indo-European legacy, that a great deal of the Spartan institutions were founded on the basis of sacred royalty, of a certain mindset that, in that sense, must forcibly be understood if you want to see how and why the Spartans did actually differ from the other Hellenes and or top them in the military art. As the Achaemenid Empire's expansion loomed over the 100 Hellenic polis, Sparta emerged as a symbol of liberty in the eyes of all. More than Athens, right? And with a greater sense of trust provided by this power. Yet, in a twist of fate, the Hellenic triumph gave rise to a transformed world where Spartan values would struggle to find their place, paradoxically fueling that same particularism, as opposed to, the Spartan particularity or distinctive characteristic. That is, in fact, a bit the same Athenian rhetoric, the idea that the Spartans, were fearsome, they were competent, but at the end of the day, were not as good as the other. And this kind of mentality is actually, you would be surprised, we see it very often in Schwerpunkt, how widespread this still is in telling world history at different levels, right? There's always a level of chauvinism, there is always a level of subjectivity that people exchange for the actual, the thing that actually matters. Like if you know how and why a country was in the past, you have a much more powerful tool to promote wherever you come from, by spotting the elements that are objectively valuable in that picture and knowing how to interact, right, with your neighbors in a profitable way, right? Pretending that, again, just like picking teams out of subjective whim, because, by the way, many people have done this with think about how overblown, for example, the achievements of Byzantine civilization are, right, in the longer term especially. Why? Because people decide to embrace that without having studied in depth the entirety of Byzantine history, and especially the one of the rest of Europe, for that matter. So this exceptionalism is used as I was saying before, a sort of puritanically hypocritical attitude to presume some kind of moral superiority of the speaker without actually substantiating this with fact or evidence or comparative capacity that are the first indicator, especially the latter, of no experience in the field whatsoever. Literally, if you don't have a diachronic comparative capacity, especially in studying the art of war, but history in general, it means that you literally do not know why certain things were in that context and that way. That you have no dimension of that. That's why, for example, people just fixate on a certain topic, such as also their own country only, are the ones that literally do not know what's the worth of their country because they cannot compare it with the others around. Now, archaeological evidence from the Spartan Acropolis, including votive offerings and bronze figurines dated to the 8th century BC, indicates that the city's martial culture was already deeply entrenched, with dedications to Athena Polucos, that is to say, Athena, protector of the city, emphasizing the centrality of warfare in Spartan religious and civic life on the most Apollonianly straightforward understanding of war, right? Many people are not aware that in Hellenic mythology, Athena beats Ares all the time, right? In the myth, right? Meaning that the animal-like sort of instinctive type of warfare gets destroyed as a lesser form of being by the higher, sort of cold but all-knowing kind of fighter that is a warrior, but it's something more, it's something above, it's something that tops, right? Sometimes we also indulge in the Athenian adage spread by Thucydides that discipline alone would be enough to win wars, right? The Romans, for example, that were much more disciplined than the classical Hellenic hoplites would have never thought something like that as well. As an element of warlikeness is always necessary, right? At some point, classical Hellenic civilization was so much in love with itself that they began to postulate that you could simply apply a divine standard to a level of humanity that evidently did not match that individual quality anymore. Well, the Spartans were in Hellas the ones who properly incarnated this, because their deal was not much that they were, say, the better warriors individually, but they were the better army collectively. And this, of course, went also in parallel with a cult of warlikeness. The Spartans were allegedly, there are some doubts about this, because I myself have my own reservations of certain things, but at least we are aware that the Spartans, at least by training the longest, and we're explicitly told by, again, random sort of, how Hellenic literature at this point is. You find all these clever quotes that are quite original and suspend, not in a vacuum, but just you can be categorical as far as the Spartans were the only hoplites who actually received a specific sword training, right? It's a bit like what we think about, the hoplites didn't really, in general, the Hellenic ones did not really use this word very much, really, right? What are those 60, 70 centimeters copis? The same goes for the Romans. The gladius is a dagger, a short sword. They were pretty large weapons, right? Made properly to chop people to pieces, hands, limbs. No, never mind that. Because there is this other idea, in fact, that Hellenic culture, also in its more stylistical refinement, and so, for example, the quite ideally described, say, not ideally described in the sense that it's the reality described is ideal per se, but a squared one, like, for example, Thucydides, that we read many times, has this, he was the author, again, of that adage on of discipline alone, eliminated from this humanly sort of reactivating warlike nature that is necessary to rise to the level of the gods, where literally discipline lives in the Olympian perfection, right? Is actually a stylistic ideal, meaning that the same Hellenes who wrote these things were actually very aware of the more primitive, the more ancestral understanding of warfare, but they wanted to offer a more polished, a more statuary And you can see it, for example, in naked heroism as well, that unfortunately prevents us from knowing a lot about certain specific arms and armor. It's not like archaeology can even answer everything, but again, I made, if anything, multiple videos on Spartan and also the rest of Hellenic hoplites as far as their panoply was concerned. It's like the Oplon heresy, other heresy. The shield was not called hoplon because hoplon meant the entire panoply. Well, yeah, but it by metaphor it did become the entire panoply, considering how relevant. And the term was and it was actually used in classical Hellenic literature to define that. Right, there is explicit passages saying that. Somebody said no, we shouldn't consider that they said that. Which may not mean, in fact, that the Oplon per se was the name of the Aspis in general, but it could overlap in a broader sense, right? This is not the only military culture in which these terminological issues, they're not issues, right? But simple, natural, logical consequences of how we would use the language would arise, right? So, the Apollonian idea rarely applied to the Spartans because indeed there is some popular prejudice that the Spartans were mostly the warrior, so this most sympathetic guy that is essentially Ares, and that instead the Spartans knew pretty well that was fallimentary in as much as the individual warrior alone that is crushed by the cohesive bunch that the Spartans actually were. The Roman fasces, from which the fascist ideology came, exactly from the same identical. And the same, if you study Greek, Latin, you know that all this, I have an entire series about it, that all these terms literally came from a metaphysical Indo-European doctrine, right, and theology that specifically resonated in these communities, cultures, and that is often also not specifically said. In fact, that's a bit the myth, that the Spartans were the big guys hitting the gym and, brutalizing helots all their time long, and the other Hellenic hoplites were just a bunch of weakling, incompetents that, didn't have any sort of military ambition. If there is one thing only that HEMA, reenactment, this kind of activities can be considered worth anything for. And you know that I don't have also in that ideological sense a great deal of sympathy towards at least the way eventually ideas are spread from these communities that have nothing to do with any trace of art of war competence whatsoever to begin with, but not even tactical or individual, military historical reconstruction, as a matter of fact, is that every single imbecile, in fact, can pick up weapons and getting himself killed by throwing himself like a fool into the melee. Literally every person has that switch inside, especially in a communitary dimension. The average Hellenic hoplite was literally fixated and obsessed with a psychopathic serial killer like Achilles, at all levels of their society. Like even the meekest, Hellenic polis that was, we don't know meek Hellenic polis for that matter, because warfare was all around and they constantly participated in even a certain chivalric errant kind of mentality. Let's also stress this aspect. What we consider as the classical Hellenic polis as sort of republican democratic systems were more often than not brutally and rigidly aristocratic societies, right? And aside, especially from Spartan Athens, most of the Hellenic world was essentially blurring towards the so-called Hellenically meant, at least barbarian dimension, all right? Which is the one, incidentally, from which these Hellenic cultures were actually coming from the Bronze Age, right? Kings, war chariots, cavalry, all right? The Hellenic hoplites developed even an anti-aristocratic bias to an extent because they prosper in that sort of more egalitarian bulk of lower estates over time, and so they oppose themselves to an idea of perceived tyranny or at least oligarchic system, and they never come. I mean, they definitely go down that path, and that's why, in part, the same warlikeness of, say, a Celtic or an Italic warrior the same age was greater than an Hellenic, even a Spartan one, but not necessarily more performing in certain situations, at least. Consider that, of course, hoplitism in this sense is mostly is practiced mostly in the aforementioned Athens and Sparta. Even the other Hellenic phalanxes were something very different, right? Especially in the colonies all across the Mediterranean. They quickly changed. And so, again, it's not like the bulk of heavy infantry that the hoplites constituted really differed, because essentially all the sedentary peoples in Europe at the time fought with heavy infantry. So in this sense, the Hellenes were not an exception. The exception is by which degree they did so from this political and social background, and therefore what kind of differences. On top of a very otherwise homogeneous basis, we can trace these characteristics as well. Plutarch, in his life of Agesilaus, king of Sparta, describes an episode during a campaign against Thebes around 370 BC. The allies of the Lacedaemonians, as you know, another name for the Spartans, complain about their heavy burden of supplying far more troops to the war while lacking any influence over its direction, which was a political issue, but obviously also a military one, because it translated itself among the Hellenes in terms of who has the strongest leverage on campaign, like in the army direction. The Spartans were more qualitative. In fact, in response, Agesilaus famously, this is a famous episode, summoned them and instructed each to stand when their trade was called, right? Potters, blacksmiths, carpenters, and others rose one by one, except the Spartans, who were barred from learning or practicing any craft other than warfare, right? Gesturing to his seated warriors, Agesilaus declared, quote, "Observe, gentlemen, how many more soldiers we send to war than you do," right? And so his point was undeniable. Sparta's renown rested on a society and political system wholly devoted to the art of war. Now, there's no doubt that how distinctive the structure was by degree, to the point of being unique among Hellenic communities, is indeed an object of debate. And there is no doubt that there has been a general approximation in terms of, okay, so the Spartans simply were something else, all right? We should be more precise about that, but that's also something you can't fully appreciate until you study the individual contingent's performance in actual combat, right? As I was saying before, and we've seen it in the videos about the Spartan drill, for example, the big deal, say, the Spartans had the same identical army of other Greeks, right? They may have had sort of different drill, different preferences, whatever. The Greeks, again, tend to categorize, to label, to say, this is the way these people does, this, they are. But as a matter of fact, the Hellenes fought pretty much in the same way. What gave the edge to the Greeks, like, I don't know, what gave the edge to the Prussians of Frederick the Great in 18th century Europe, where literally all Europeans fought in the same identical way, was a radically consistent amount of training that, at least as we'll see now, and as it is notorious, by political and social degree, was not affordable by other polis in the measure Sparta did. That was, however, also producing less numbers as a consequence because it cost more, and this is also notorious. If you study, just recently I uploaded that video about the best tanks of World War II. Yes, you understand that the better the tank and the less there were of them. This is exactly the same concept, all right? Because training also costs, right? So it's not about how many troops you can arm, it's how many you can field with an homogeneous level of training. And in fact, Sparta's sort of explicit advantage over the other Hellenic infantries consisted in the speed and order with which they could form into battle. Simply meaning that, if you were deprived of this quality, you would simply have weaker lines, less time to properly counter the enemy moves, and so you would have gone into combat with a significant disadvantage. It's not because, and sure, the Spartans in that sense would have had still a more sort of individual, warlike vibe. But this is what people often don't understand, that these things are not directly proportional or antithetical, especially. The Romans, for example, had a much greater collective training, but they also had a much greater individual warlike spirit that went fully in parallel with two things. They were not in opposition to one another at all. Read Caesar about Pharsalus, among the various others. I promised to start a series about Indo-European metaphysics through the commentary by Caesar, because literally the way he writes that in Latin tells you again how much more primitive and martial the Romans were, for example, to Thucydides writing hundreds of years before, and how much, in fact, these military systems differed at the core, even though they were still pretty much continental European peoples with heavy infantry fighting against one another, yet the Romans had the upper hand. Why? This is the same for the Spartans to a degree. Again, not directly proportional even with the Roman, that had, for example, lots of troops to send, but also very well geared up for war to a degree that not even the Spartans would have ever admitted. In fact, if you look at the same period of the Macedonian armies of the Hellenistic phalanx, you realize that the problem of the Hellenes had somehow remained. This was not just shared by the Spartans, that the extension of their citizenship was a great problem for them. Also because they insisted on their own exceptionality, which is a bit like the same mentality that we derived a bit from the Hellenes when thinking history and similar contexts. Now, the Spartan distinctive system was admittedly unique among Hellenic communities. You can look at different polis and understanding that they all somehow varied from one another. We've seen it also in other similar contexts to this, for example, the medieval Italian communes. They were basically all alike, but there was obviously some difference in between. And the Spartans had, and we've seen it because there weren't even too many other polis that could compete to begin with. It's not like the hundreds of Hellenic polis ever reached the level of Sparta. Maybe there were many more militaristic systems that, however, were crushed and or faded away. Still, this system was credited to the reforms of the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus between the 9th and the 8th centuries BC, which already tells you that, yeah, we don't fully know. This is an incredibly archaic time. Not even cavalry had been properly developed at that point as a fully fledged arm. There were still chariots around, and still, by the way, the Hellenic hoplites would also fight on horseback at some point. It's a bit like the problem with the Anglo-Saxons, that we all believe that they, by tradition, wouldn't fight on horseback, except they actually did. If anything, they didn't do that in large enough numbers, and we explained countless times why. It's a bit like the same for the broader Hellenes that, as you know, reject a bit that tyrannical chariot, cavalry warfare-based type of vision of the world, and rise up as essentially a militarized peasantry. Citizen soldiery essentially is too much, at least in the archaic times, because the soldiery entails you're paid literally properly as a professional. When you look at farmers that gravitated around the polis, that lived in the polis and sustained themselves with the work of their slaves working in the field, that's most of what we're looking at. And as we've seen with the example of Agesilaus before, of course, that was fairly late in time. So, of course, there were more people more invested in sort of menial crafts. But, say, in archaic times, there was a much more radically rigid Indo-European divide between the freemen, who essentially did not work, because in Indo-European identity, who works is a slave. And that, therefore, that, in fact, could dedicate himself to warfare. That was the actual deal of men, while others could and would maintain him with their work, the slaves. And you immediately understand that the Spartans were still essentially the system that maintained the most that vision and that mentality. So it's not something alien to Hellenic culture. It is something more archaic, more traditional, that the Spartan conservative mindset sticks to across the centuries. To a degree, they changed themselves. Spartan society was strictly divided into three classes, three estates, we should say: the Spartiates, an elite of citizens equal in rights and responsibilities; the Helots, slaves tied to the land; and the Perioikoi, semi-free individuals who pursued other trades and were fundamentally also connected with the other polis that Sparta ruled over, by the way, in a sort of feudal hierarchy. Naturally, this is very simple, just 3 lines. Things change over time. There were lots of intersections, overlappings. However, fundamentally, this was what Spartan society was about. The Spartiates, as a veritable elite, sustained themselves through the produce of land work by helots, unburdened by material concerns, allowing them to focus entirely on martial training. We should point out, as I said before, that these were polis, so they didn't have an actual interland. It's not like, the Kingdom of Macedonia, where in fact, the same nobility aristocracy was all about war, like in any feudal society. But there was also, in fact, a more far-ranging kind of control. If anything, if you need a mounted elite, you must have large estates controlled just by very few people. Obviously, the Peloponnese was something different. It was a more egalitarian system, and in fact, you see less cavalry around, even though it existed. And if you look at the times of the Peloponnesian War, there was actually a pretty intense cavalry warfare in Hellas as well. Still, however, obviously, infantry was the decisive arm, and the phalanx system, in this sense, would not be surpassed. Excavations in the Messenian region, particularly at sites like Nicoria, revealed that helots were organized into state-controlled agricultural settlements producing surplus grain and olive oil to support the Spartiates, with ceramic evidence suggesting a highly regulated economy to sustain the system, which definitely aligns with the notion that this military aristocracy did really control this large amounts of land, because even to be just like this peaked infantry force, they needed to get resources from somewhere, and so still estates were in control of these Spartiates clans to an important extent, to an important degree. In the 7th century BC, a new form of combat was taking gradually shape in Hellas with the, let's say, general introduction of let's stick to the heresy, the hoplon, a circular, deeply concave shield. I described this in quite thorough detail in multiple videos, the ones about the Spartan, the Hellenic hoplites, and why the Romans and the Etruscans never actually fought the classical Hellenic phalanx way, regardless of some people still inexplicably think, after so much has been produced historiographically. This shield offered strong protection not only to the warrior who carried it, but also in a disciplined and tightly packed formation, the comrade on his left. All the kind of digressions possible. There's going to be always the person who's telling you, oh, but no, they didn't actually fight in a thickly packed formation. They were flexible, they could open the rank. Yeah, and so heavy infantry does not fight in a thickly packed formation. All the references to this type of combat, the necessity also to just have a more thickly packed formation, capable of maintaining that order and still functionally fighting that way, is something that we assume not just from the ergonomy of the shield, but also from the necessary order imposed to people, in fact, that did not necessarily have too much collective training, which was the great problem of the Greeks back in the day, because as we've seen, these were not professional soldiers. The Spartans came close to that, to something like semi-professional, we can say, by other historical standards, say the Macedonian peasantry. Admittedly, there is level of general military competence that we were just pointing out before, regarding the fact that, again, it's not like the Greeks were people that didn't have a familiarity with warfare, or that conceived the latter in just distant terms because they didn't witness it firsthand, right? I don't want to continue digressing specifically on the divide between the idea and the reality in not as hypostatically separated dimensions. There isn't, say, a way of political warfare work that is actually hidden by the classical sources. It's rather pointing out certain aspects that are more ideally important, right? They're more morally important, if you prefer, rather than strict measures, indeed. But we understand that this type of shield was also designed to create some, essentially, shield walls, provided that, of course, the spear is always what makes the deal. And that even though, of course, hoplites would often fight also with more open formation, they would recur to the thickest one just in particular moments, it was still a thickly packed heavy infantry clashing head down with one another in cohesion among these men, by the way, that came from the same clans, from the same families, was kind of natural. It was felt like not, again, a matter of Olympic individualistic heroism actually performed, just because, for example, we do think that in order to slash longer weapons, for example, you needed some broader formation. We've also seen how the same hoplites actually have similar swords to basically any other sedentary people, so they would have used that, right? But in less, by less degree than the more sort of habituated, almost all year, or at least every year round warfare practiced by, say, I don't know, tribal warriors in the more interland parts of Europe, even in proximities of the same Hellas, right? And this, in general, is victorially confirmed by the way we know how surrounding peoples also fought, with more open formations and tougher terrain, practicing hit-and-run skirmishes and so on. They could constitute very thickly packed formations as well, but their panoply was not specifically designed for that. And we understand also, by the way, that the hoplon, in this sense, truly understood as the hoplitic panoply, was, of course, used also by other peoples in more open combat, right? And that, of course, using this type of arms and armor is not alone, of course, the reason why we can claim the type of combat in an individual sense, either with this order or another, because it indeed really changed. But let's say a Scythian knight who used hoplitic armor obviously wouldn't fight like an Hellenic citizen in the 5th century BC, provided that there were also lighter types of properly special, at least tactically specialized forces, including lighter hoplites, for not talking about skirmishers, missiles. They were always there, that however still gravitating around the phalanx as heavy infantry, with that more thickly packed profile. Archaeological finds from Olympia, including bronze hoplon fragments dated to circa the mid-7th century BC, show fairly standardized designs, suggesting widespread adoption across the Hellenic polis as early as that. Naturally, this type of shield is indeed functional for some type of proper individual protection, which does not necessarily prove a defensivistic mentality of hoplitism, but that definitely aligns with this tactical conservatism. All right, there is an idea that, especially in the more archaic times, at this point when the polis had sort of fragmented broader dominations of the Bronze Age, of course, the range of the phalanxes in terms of strategic reach was fairly short. There is an idea of almost chivalric sort of negotiation of where to fight in the few open plains of Greece. Again, those who countered the Hellenic, say the hoplitic heresy, They suggest, but the hoplites did not fight only on flat ground. Well, yes, we know that from so many battle accounts, which we don't even normally cite. But what does that mean? Like, heavy infantry can't deploy on sort of more rugged terrain? It depends how rugged that is, right? If you're talking a forest, obviously that can't be the case. If you're talking about hills, slopes, even crossing streams, whatever, yeah, of course, that's what heavy infantry normally can do, even in times where you would think that, I don't know, like in the early Middle Ages, where most people think that there was no training, everything was sort of more loose. Doesn't mean anything. We know from the general tactical profiles of different battlegrounds that heavy infantry mostly fought in the same way, that, of course, more broken formations could occur even just because of different reasons during the battle, but the standard was pretty much the one we find in any other people, and we shouldn't be so mechanistic or, say, materialistic in explaining how units fight like or are designed for. Within a few decades, this shield and its accompanying fighting style spread widely across Hellas, being straightforward and well-suited to the defensive needs of a society rooted in small-scale land-owning farmers. So mostly privileging that individual protection, right? Hence the necessity for this more enveloping cover, which in fact did not necessarily mean a too heavy equipment. Actually, the more archaic hoplites were incredibly heavy, right? The elite ones, at least, just in line with the gradual lightening from the Bronze Age era. Think about the Dendra panoply and what that actually meant in terms of also individual fighting. This dilutes, but let's say the hoplon remains the hallmark of the hoplite, thus showing that the individual protection for this sort of middle-class farmer fighters, or so to say, was relevant. There is a compromise between, say, the cost of war in societies that are not intensively fighting, enormous, regional campaigns requiring an enormous amount of economic and demographic strains, like, the Achaemenid Empire in certain cases. These are communities that properly and granularly refine their own military resources, employment, and distribution. The farmers were prosperous enough to afford the expensive yet effective shield and inclined to fight as a unified group of peers in order to maximize their collective effectiveness, and so deflecting individual professionalization, specialization, which in fact did not require extensive training, right? The Spartans, however, and that's as much as they differed, mastered every aspect and possibility of hoplitic warfare. If we understand this as something more specifically tailored to Hellas, and so already, like the characteristics that we have just listed applying already to the Spartans compared to, say, any other Balkan hinterland people, right? With the Spartans, however, within the Hellenic system, becoming unparalleled experts in a military practice that, ironically, thrived among the Hellenes because it suited amateur fighters. And this is where you can actually say that, yeah, also Sparta was great in many ways, but that, paradoxically, this way of war stemmed from, overall, a less militarized mentality that the Spartans sort of maintained at the highest relatively to this system. At the same time, and this is my impression, by having studied by now a consistent amount of classical Hellenic warfare, is that we're probably sort of underestimating the Hellenic hoplite sort of military potential in general as a fighter, right? It is true, absolutely, that there is no match. Say, from an individual point of view, again, you pick a Celt, you pick a Scythian, there is no doubt that in their battle lines they would have sort of more aggressive warriors we'd seen all before that were just devoted to a constantly military mindset. The Greeks actually described this as a barbarian lifestyle, and so their deflection from that individual commitment was the measure of their racial superiority, hence Thucydides' concept that discipline alone could have worked. except it doesn't, right? And that's also why Hellas was at some point probably overrun by professional forces, whether you look at the Macedons or the Romans. However, the general profile of these fighters was still well within the, say, Iron Age kind of average rank and file sort of European warlike minded freemen, right? And this is important, especially when you realize that hoplite exceptionalism, compared especially from the rest of society, was exactly what the polis had been born like. This was not a democratic system, right? The demos ended up essentially, of course, characterizing, especially in Athens, the larger part of the population, but it was, let's say, the system was never run by the demos, and it was run instead by an aristocracy that was quite in practice in existence within the same freemen. Reason for which, by the way, the same hoplites were quite compact because, again, there was a relatively egalitarian distribution of wealth unseen in other places, but on top, of course, a surplus that was controlled still by these freemen, right? Also in Athens, there were different estates that, of course, corresponded to different levels of participation, for example, to the same phalanx. Sparta was just the place where this was more accentuated. So yes, they were like all the others, but they were also the exception with more straightforwardly feudally minded approaches that had once belonged, up to a few centuries before, to the entire system, with even some kings practically ruling and having also similar forms of recruitment. So we shouldn't even properly fixate so much on the hoplitic arms and armor per se, rather on how and why they had come to develop exactly at that point, and why Sparta also maintained with a specific system while, let's say, paying for the elite nature of its forces compared to the other Greeks. Inscriptions from the Spartan sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, dated to the 6th century BC, document ritual competitions among young Spartiates, including mock battles that honed their hoplite skills, reinforcing their dominance in phalanx tactics. This was admittedly, yes, done by pretty much every polis. This did not actually correspond to, again, a professional training, as we've seen also the Spartans do this, essentially as the other Greeks in more pronounced ways that will eventually also, through military experience, that, as we will see now, they would gain through a more intense type of actual combat, of actual war making per individual. It's not like the other hoplites, the other polis wouldn't do this, but they did that in a more diluted fashion. And so also the collective training resented of this. In any case, each and every place, even, a Celtic village would have this kind of festival competitions where the young men were to be tested by the entire community and testing each other, as they would have been eventually integrated into the actual war bands and or like the militias of the same community. So, as you understand, even in embryonally speaking, the Hellenes do not actually differ from. This is a pretty universal way of organizing forces. Again, you must understand by which degree this was true among these different peoples and among the same Hellenes for the Spartans. By the 5th century BC, Spartan invincibility was legendary even beyond Hellenic borders, a proof that their military reputation had been proven on the battlefield. However, Sparta's deeply conservative nature made it a power reluctant to pursue expansion, which is the paradox, or at least the obvious consequence for that particular type of elite, yet a fragile system to some other extent, because as you understand, it had narrower bases for collective participation. Vice versa, the more liberal polis would have sort of a greater pool of troops, but of lower quality, and so they could embark themselves, like the Athenians, in sort of pretty ill-fated adventures, yet in fact suffering when confrontation with the Spartans at some point they will not want to face in open field will be concerned. Consider here we're talking centuries of history, so you can't cherry pick, I don't know, the Spartans were defeated at Leuctra. Well, but after centuries of primacy, that narrative, for example, but the Spartan system was inferior, it was declining. How? It eventually failed. Well, which system doesn't fail historically? Like, is there like a political and social system that always remains the same and or that does not decline as another rises, right? You can say the same for Athens if you really look at it in historical hindsight. And again, as I pointed out before, the Spartans had their own revival in the later centuries when they didn't count much anymore internationally, but in creating, for example, an actual Macedonian phalanx, almost fully and properly by size, so with the resources, by the way, of their provincial power, that not even Pergamon, for example, as a Diadochoi, military, like a polity, would able to afford in spite of its regional dimension. So you can't properly compare things so straightforwardly for no reason, right? And saying, okay, well, the Spartans eventually were defeated, but who wasn't defeated in this system? Who didn't eventually fade away? And why do we even remember the Spartans, if not for having maintained a pretty high level of fierce, especially terrestrial forces quality, being able, by the way, to compete with Athens also on a broader level through their alliance system, also their naval forces and more. So again, everything was more homogeneous than it normally seemed. Like Thucydides records that Sparta's Peloponnesian League, formalized by the mid-6th century BC, included treaties ensuring allied poleis provided troops under Spartan command, reflecting Sparta's preference for regional hegemony over further, say, territorial conquests of direct control. This naturally was quite important because it allowed for the Spartans also to inform these other polis militaries in a way that they would be dependent on Sparta for this same kind of level of expertise and ultimate command at the end of the day. You understand, however, that also the system was relatively homogeneous. It's not like these allies were fighting in a particularly different fashion from the Spartans. The Spartans, again, were just better than them. And they had just managed to hegemonize these other polis on top of their strategic and political strength. Still, when conflicts between the Hellenic colonies in Asia Minor and the Persian Empire escalated to a critical point, the Hellenic world turned to Sparta for support. It wasn't Athens. It was understood at the time, and we are in fairly archaic times because, again, we're looking at the beginning of the Persian wars. The Peloponnesian one is relatively far away, at least if we understand, again, that hoplitism was yet to fully sort of look what we have stereotyped. But it's not like before this, there was something dramatically different. Heavy infantry was still there, and already all those characteristics for which we single out the Hellenic heavy infantry under the term of hoplitism had been manifesting in a common fashion. So not just here or there or scattered, but integrally, systematically, right? And already at that point, the Spartans had the upper hand. We could and will at some point look at also why Sparta emerged like this. It's difficult to simply answer. It has a lot to do actually with the permanence of particular traditional religious beliefs that inform, in fact, their entire political and military vision and system. Though hesitant and lacking fervor in this broader international scene, Sparta was thrust in the role of defender of Hellenism, right? A bit like the Hellenic panoply was mostly conceived in a protective fashion. So the Hellenes considered their world as basically the center of the universe. We just discussed this in recent Indo-European theology videos, Delphi representing essentially the womb of the world where the divine strike had ingravitated the earth and allowed this divine race of the Greeks to spread. Naturally, great part of the Hellenic world was actually within the Achaemenid Empire already, just it was not directly controlled or conquered by the kings of kings. And Sparta's role as the defender of Hellenism would be fulfilled on Spartan own terms, much as Athens and later Macedonia, Philip, and Alexander the Great would do. Right? Remember that Sparta at some point was also allied with the Persians, mostly in a time in which there wasn't much of a specific threat posed by at least the Persians, and immediately yet another Persian war. Hellenism signified a shared language and culture, but little beyond that. Right? It did not encompass uniform political systems or governance structures which differed greatly among city-states, nor consistent economic priorities of social conditions which were undergoing rapid change across the Hellenic world. We say Hellenistic, of course, mostly I use the term mostly from Alexander onward, right? Philip II. So we are in a phase of, but properly the Alexandrian conquests as a completely different phase in the history of the world. Never also commit the easy mistake of thinking that Macedonian phalanx essentially developed from the classical Hellenic one, because they are two completely different systems, one belonging to combined arms, the latter in fact being quite primitive, as we were pointing out before, also in relation to the Achaemenids that had a more developed military than the Greeks and were not defeated, in fact, because of otherwise. In any case, the Hellenic world per se was fairly homogeneous, as we explained. So there were different calibrations of power. With the first victory of the Greeks during, in fact, the first Persian War, you understand that so-called tyrannical model incarnated by essentially monarchic rulers that were the norm at the time, I would like to stress, in the Hellenic world broadly meant. And in fact, only in Athens and Sparta being something slightly different, or consistently different, but still, right, would in fact evaporate further. Those were, again, Attica, the Peloponnese, the areas where the system had been surpassed the earliest and producing, in fact, also this higher military capacity. The Athenians weren't bad either, right? Again, we must always understand what kind of point of reference we're looking at, what kind of term of comparison we are employing in order to express a judgment on this or that power. Because it's easy to equivocate, say, but they were all sort of the same, but they kind of also different, so where's the middle ground? Well, it's just that historical sophistication and sort of quality juggling that habituates you to define this better. For a layman, it's more difficult to get that, and it's kind of obvious. And the best way to realize that is studying military history of these peoples from the actual primary sources, which, by the way, for classical Hellas is possibly the easiest. In some ways, it's not easy, but it's the most accessible, right, and the most straightforward that you can imagine. Also because these people literally thought very similarly to you already, because they were, again, more modern, secular at some point to write. And again, as we were saying before, Spartan particularism is probably connected also with a different mindset that, in fact, is not voiced as loudly as, say, the Athenian one, that was more liberal and less traditional to an extent. When you understand how sort of actually traditional and primitive the same Athenian system was by the first millennium BC, you can understand also how way more the Spartan one was in comparison, or even just the other ones in Europe. From the late 6th to the early 15th centuries BC, the Achaemenid Empire's ambitions clashed with the dynamic Hellenic civilization. The process began with the absorption of the Ionian colonies in Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, which retains some autonomy under Achaemenid rule. Cuneiform tablets from Persepolis dated to 509 BC list tribute payments from Ionian polis, including silver and textiles, indicating their integration into the Persian administrative system. always remember that Herodotus was historically from these very lands, and he knew also a big deal, like also later Xenophon, if anything, because he went over also to the Achaemenid Empire at some point, a lot about how sort of traditional the word of the kings really were, what tyranny meant, what's the value of these Hellenic hoplites that still, again, in the mindset of the Greeks, resonated as the great heroes of the Iliad at some level. They were not all equal. They were exceptionally compact for the time standards, and as much as exceptionally already gentrified to an extent, but still part of that primitive, brutal, bloody, and aggressive world that you can imagine, in fact, the mid-first millennium BC being. The Achaemenid Empire then set its sights on the most distant and vibrant cities like Athens, with whom the great king had tense relations, exactly in virtue of their rampant growth and this sort of different mindset that the Persians, also to a degree, would not really understand and would find to be a sort of an aberration. In Athens, in particular, a bold and enterprising quote-unquote democratic, there was nothing like a democracy, especially at this point in Athenian history, faction representing emerging artisanal and commercial classes rather than traditional landowners, but it could be actually similar and overlapping, was gaining strength, right? And this was sort of, again, the liberal side of the story, especially as the rule of the few and the necessity for a greater redistribution of wealth was concerned. Again, by caliber, by degree, this was partially needed, and even the part of the success of the polis. So we look at this even within the more conservative contexts, right? It's a direction. Don't consider in this sense the Athenians a bunch of debauched individuals, especially by contemporary standards. Of course, for the times, they would have looked like that, right? It would have been this kind of contrast that, however, is also the one existing with civilization, sort of less individual value, but more collective one, given the sheer necessity of governing a bigger system that, of course, eliminates some standards in another part of the mechanism. This group, by the way, was daring enough to back the Ionian Hellenes revolt against Persia. Herodotus notes that Athens sent 20 triremes to aid the Yonian Revolt in 499, a decision voted by the Athenian assembly, highlighting the democratic faction's influence. After suppressing his Hellenic subjects, Emperor Darius shifted his focus to their mainland kin, determined to punish them for their meddling. His ambitions were thwarted in 490 at the Battle of Marathon, that I made a video on, also for the campaign. We will probably come back that at some point. I will start at some point some more kind of basic evenemential, including civilian history of classical Greece, because mostly here we dealt with military stuff, but at least we have that already well done by this point. The Battle of Marathon, the Athenians, under Miltiades' leadership, as we've seen, repelled the Achaemenid forces. This, again, we do not digress on the entire mechanism. It was, if anything, a battle that showed the limits also of Hellenic troops. For example, in hand-to-hand combat by the ships, were the, in fact, more warlike average of the Achaemenid forces inflicted the greatest amount of casualties during the battle. At the same time, the Athenians, let's say that all these forces showed, because it was a coalition, an important degree of cohesion. At least the Athenian center broke, but the wings, for example, wheeled about and successfully squeezed the Achaemenids, would started routing. If anything, the greater problem was avoiding missile fire. We were talking just about it the other day for the sagas in the Achaemenid army, exactly at the Battle of Marathon. So many topics intertwining. It's so interesting. The problem was maintaining order at sustained speed, and the Battle of Marathon is almost a miracle in terms of Hellenic success against the Achaemenids. There wasn't a gigantic divide either. Again, the Achaemenid military was much more complex and ineffective in broader context, but not quite in that one. The Greeks also fought their own battle in a sense. The Spartans arrived after the battle had concluded, but would soon play a role again. Xerxes, Darius' successor, launched a new offensive with an army numbering in the hundreds of thousands, allegedly at least, this time not just to chastise Hellas, but to subjugate it. Achaemenid military records inscribed on clay tablets from Susa detail the mobilization of 180,000 troops from 46 satrapies of the provinces of the Achaemenid Empire for Xerxes' campaign, including Median cavalry and Bactrian archers, underscoring the scale of the invasion. I made a video about Xerxes' army order of battle, which explains essentially that, of course, troops were much more contained. In general, there would have been a wide mobilization all across the Achaemenid Empire, but let's say just for the sake of logistical sustainability, of course, there wasn't, like especially in a single army operating with more than 50,000 men, realistically, and that's what the Achaemenids would have actually not even used in the narrow confines of the Hellenic, terrain. The great king would have shown leniency to the defeated, granting them some autonomy, but profound changes would have followed nonetheless, right? And that's where the Hellenic spirit stands out. Hellas would have been basically, like in case of Persian victory, integrated into a sort of cosmopolitan, multicultural, and multi-religious empire where, at least nominally, slavery was outlawed. So we will talk about that because it's not really true that the Achaemenid Empire did not have slavery. But there was some greatness, of course, of this system. Too much, however, diluted across this enormous territory, and the more despotic character of Persian rule was evident to the Hellenes of Ionia as much as now the ones of the Hellenic mainland. Aristocratic estates would have been handed over to the great king and administered by his officials. Justice would have been dispensed by Xerxes' representatives, and taxes would have filled Persian coffers rather than funding monuments in Hellenic polis. Naturally, this did not sound great, did it, right? Persian administrative seals from Sardis, dated to 480, depict satrapal officials overseeing tax collection, suggesting probably a model that would have been applied to Hellas in a way that the Persians would have considered like applied just to barbarians, right, and to some kind of curious cultural abnormality, right? But the same resistance of the Hellenes would turn out to be a surprise. The agoras, the central squares of the polis, were risking to no longer serve as venues for public assemblies. Laws would stem from royal decrees, but would instead become marketplaces policed by a strict, ever-present force, like in the, Mesopotamian cities guarded over by the Persian citadels and garrisons, effectively crushing an autonomous Hellenic government and having much of the Hellenic resources absorbed by the greater universal empire of the King of Kings. Politicians would vanish as well, as would academies, philosophical discussions, and scientific pursuits. All aspects that, in the traditional mindset of the time, were considered to be too liberal, too daring, too against the constituted order. In part, this would also be the case, as we've seen in our video about the rise and fall of the Hellenic civilization. The peak, like the seminal constitution of Hellenic identity, pride and spirit, had been founded way before this, and all these more contemplative activities, including, as we've seen, the dilution of warfare into some mostly theoretically distanced reality that just barbarians would pursue, were the measure of what would have become eventually the same Hellenic decadence, right? For example, during the same Hellenism that rejected a great deal of monarchic and more sort of feudal, martial mentality. In any case, there's no doubt that had the Achaemenids won the Persian wars against Hellas, much of what we understand, like the Hellenic thought, would have not been. Knowledge would primarily flow from the divinations of astrologers and magicians, richly funded by the king and his nobles, and closely tied to the state and religious bureaucracy. The Beistun inscription, commissioned by Darius I, emphasizes the role of Zoroastrian priests in state governance, indicating that similar religious administrative systems would have dominated Hellenic intellectual life under the Achaemenid rule. More to come in the next weeks about traditional Iranian religion. The Spartans' role in defending Hellas was not vast in numbers, but etched an enduring legacy in history. 300 Spartiates, alongside a few thousand allies, made a futile stand to block the Achaemenid advance at the pass of Thermopylae in the summer of 480. Never made a video about the Thermopylae. Very interesting battle, often misunderstood also in a general strategic sense, and especially starting from probably the mythology of the Spartan will to simply stand their ground or die, right? Of course, there was a lot of that, absolutely, on the fore, but there would have still been a possibility to make it out of there alive. The Spartans weren't looking forward to be outflanked, right, through those damn passes. But we don't even know exactly which one they were. As you know, the Thermopylae were a battleground in multiple times in history, and basically the battles were always resolved through the same way. But the paths are debated. We don't fully know, especially for the 480 most famous clash, how things literally unfolded. If you're interested, I also talk about the Battle of the Thermopylae between the Romans and the Seleucids later in the 2nd century BC in the aforementioned video about the Roman Manipular Legion against the Hellenistic Macedonian phalanx. The Spartan sacrifice stood, however, as a pinnacle of resolve, which was surely as impressively displayed, to say the least. Excavations at Thermopylae have uncovered spearheads and arrowheads primarily of Achaemenid origin, confirming the intense combat in the Spartans' defensive position at the narrow pass. I still have to make videos about properly Achaemenid, say, ethnic Persian troops that were sort of the most fearsome in the forces of the kings of kings. But as we've seen, I was recalling it before as well, we recently made videos about the Sakas in the Achaemenid army, as well as many other ethnicities out there. There is properly a playlist, not for the auxiliaries of the Achaemenid army, but about the Achaemenid army as a whole. Then we will expand it further. And obviously, like here you see how heavy overall the Hellenes were. The Spartans and their allies, heavy infantry versus a lighter type of combat that the Achaemenids pursued, just because of the nature of their general forces, right? In the open plains of Mesopotamia or in some sort of steppe grounds and beyond. Of course, there was much greater option of cavalry employment. Infantry did not need to be so bulky and sort of, again, entrenched, or at least so quite, like in this case at the Thermopylae Pass, exploiting natural barriers, defenses. This is obviously what we have explained also through the Thaumkriege series, a position that the military inferior occupies, because of course, like in this case, they're much less, the Greeks are much less than the Achaemenids, and in general, the whole situation is not one of the best for them internationally, strategically. It pains me, of course, to skip here so simply the Battle of Thermopylae 480, but again, I'm preparing some videos on the topic anyway. In the ensuing naval Battle of Salamis, the Hellenic fleet led by the Athenian Themistocles annihilated Xerxes' navy, averting the specter, at least of an Achaemenid rule. maritime archaeological surveys of Salamis, by the way, have recorded trireme rams and pottery dated to the same 480, aligning with at least more or less with the general chronology, evidencing the scale of the naval engagement. It was really intense, and even there, it's the same story. The lanes were more agile; they could outmaneuver the Achaemenid. If you have an idea of how naval battles were normally fought, there was here not an enormous divide between how the Achaemenid fleets, by the way, were Phoenician, were again from peoples that were similar to the Greeks. We talked about the development also early first millennium BC warships. So extremizing too much is not useful. Just like saying, I don't know, the Achaemenids were lighter than the Hellenes on average doesn't mean that they didn't have their heavy infantry. That also is heavy, not because it has heavy armor necessarily. That also may come to be a problem at some point, but because they are able to stand their ground against such also heavily armored troops. Otherwise, by definition, they would be just light infantry and they would fight differently. However, that's also why you see all those arrows at the Thermopylae Pass properly dug out. But what Hellas and what Hellenism triumphed at Salamis, this is another story, right? That victory notoriously marked a pivotal shift, so significant that Plato, there was a quite aristocratic-minded figure, lamented it, right? In fact, he literally says that Salamis made the Hellenes worse as a people, right? It's as if proletarians here forming the fighting rank element of a successful military enterprise, connecting like a great part of countries, so to say, including one that heads towards sort of autocratic global dominance, spread this marxistically tolerant kind of ideas out there, and so being part of a general advancement, but eroding further the top, the elite, the establishment with this kind of ideology that gradually undermines the minds and the spirits. And we have experienced in the West something very similar to this. The society Plato yearned for was an aristocracy, which, by the way, does not mean that, in the sense, the rest of the world is any better, because this can happen only in the more rising and qualitative system to encompass and to hold still with this kind of negative element within. Now, the society Plato yearned for was an aristocratic one where voting was tied to land ownership, right? Politics was the domain of conservative, self-sufficient landowners who, sustained by slave labor, could engage in governance with a sense of duty and the lofty moral and civic ideals Plato cherished. It's not like everything suddenly changed, right? Just there is a massive shift toward, however, some more truly, democratically leaning mentality. The Battle of Salamis ushered in this new class, the sailors, rowers, and propertyless wage earners, fueled by ambition, a flair for risk and trade, and a hunger for lucrative public roles and prestigious positions to promote their interests. So the new rich, but because of course it's not like those proletarians would ever come to power, even in Athens. But there is a greater populistic wave. There is the sense that again that these people emerge from backgrounds that are not traditionally cultured, that have like this erosively flattening view of human worth, etc. The Piraeus port excavations reveal a surge in commercial amphora just after the time of Salamis, indicating the rising economic influence of Athens' maritime and mercantile classes after Salamis. You can properly measure this. The crews of Salamis opened the gates to a vibrant, audacious, potentially corrupt, but undeniably nimble and resolute West, at least in the Hellenic source, capable of overcoming the Persian and any other adversary. Not quite, however, because of this. The Macedons weren't like this, for example, and ultimately the Greeks fenced off the Persian invasion, but did not destroy the Achaemenid Empire, at least not this polis. This was a Hellas far removed from the one the Spartans had fought for, yet much closer to the world we paradoxically recognize today. and that we can learn from exactly in this loss of control, this loss of standards, right? That make us see, for example, the Spartans as a negative system, a bad one, one that wasn't actually about all that nobility and quality and warlikeness and effectiveness. You see, those Spartans eventually declined. Well, which power hasn't declined at some point? So when you look at the Spartan, we took a bit this detour looking at the broader picture, because I think it's important to explain better what's the context where the Spartan military developed in general. And remember that today's video is just a broader reflection on the topic. Now, the Spartans' military supremacy is something that paradoxically develops further. This is recognized after the Persian Wars, when in fact, the horizons of the individual polis are extended to the point of creating different leagues and counterposed against one another, a sort of factionalism and broader system of alliances that would, in fact, champion different types of beliefs. Just like today, at the time, the political extremes of this spectrum would be present in part in both systems, all right? It's not, and that were, as we've seen, also pretty similar, meeting in between, overlapping, intersecting in the between. There are many Athenians that serviced in Sparta. There were many Greeks, as we've seen, that would keep servicing, for example, the Persians. And they weren't the bad ones. They weren't the non-developed ones either. So politics is complicated, and you can imagine how this translates military-wise. That, however, concretely speaks of a synchrosis as well. The system would have not been so changing, at least in all these superficial orientations, hadn't it been like a pretty substantially based one, right? Especially now, when the Hellenes had defeated the rulers of the universe. This is a perspective which is often rejected, as if, by the way, the Hellenes simply believed already that they were the only ones in the universe. Telling the truth, there was already something like that in a typical Hellenic xenophobia and, again, self-referentiality. You can see it even as a form of provincialism compared to a universal empire like the Achaemenid one, but it's not really correct, because the Dorian foundation of the world was really the greatest crowning achievement, probably of the Indo-European waves of conquest. Admittedly, Hellas had historically been, in this sense, the greatest prize in Europe, and that's why the best of the Indo-Europeans basically seize it. But the reason was that it was so rich that it had such a heavily stratified culture that continued since the Bronze Age to preserve itself. Like there are certain cultures that have it much easier to change and adapt because they haven't such a millenary background, right? That makes them more resistant to kind of external influences, at least in a they make them less acceptive towards these external influences. That's why we also talk of the Hellenes in such exceptionalistic fashion, because we read this history through their own lens, right? And we fall a bit in their same traps at so many different levels: rationalism, technologism, positivism, etc. We talked about this in the videos about Polybius that we encountered, at least in some sources on the Roman army video, and also obviously in the aforementioned one of the Rome versus the Diadochoi. When I say Diadochoi, obviously meaning the successors in general, like not just the generation of the Diadochoi, but the polis that they created after the Megas' death. So the Spartans, a strict discipline paired with a rejection of luxury and idleness. This was the formula devised by Lycurgus, which set the ideal standards, the mythological standards of Spartan society. Spartan inscriptions from the Mykolaion sanctuary dated to the 7th century BC list contributions to communal messes, Suscitia, including barley and wine, showing how shared meals reinforce group cohesion among the Spartiates. You have the famous epitaph, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here we lie obedient to their laws." Sounds better, obedient to their laws, here we lie. This was crafted by the poet Simonides of Chaos for the monument of the fallen at the Thermopylae. This, of course, maintains that idea of communal worth, like unity, loyalty, utmost sacrifice. Now, were the Spartans fundamentally about this? Yes. But were they fundamentally about this for some particular Spartan reason? Yes, but this was a reason really grounded on the entire past of these peoples. All right. The 5th century BC, who were, the Greeks in the previous centuries, right? What kind of ethos existed? We somehow, I'm a medievalist, so I see how long the traditional spirit of, in this case, Indo-European ancestry, and also other, of course, Pelasgian influence, is as far as properly the concept of war, the concept of self-sacrifice in holy combat, the idea that warfare was the measure of the capacities of mankind to come back to divinity. The Spartans were incredibly devoted to their own race, to the concept that their leaders, their rulers, had actually a pretty close connection with God, right? If you look at Hellenic mythology, that at some point becomes history, realize that every single character descends from Zeus. And this was obviously the universal belief. This was true for the Romans, was true for the Germans. They had all the same religion, they had all the same single God, the others being just emanations of the same, used to explain different things and, say, profiling different forces acting in the universe, and presuming that Hellenic history was just a history of democracy or sort of liberal thinking, of free thinking, of science, of technology or whatever, is to basically destroy the entire and basically only value that these peoples abided by. Right, militarily, religiously, there was no other way but to stand your ground and die. It's not like an Athenian would say, well, okay, I'm fleeing, I'm a coward, it's fine. Right, their entire societal mentality despised these people. Right, you have an idea of how truly archaic and brutal these communities really were, even in the most allegedly democratic case, which was not properly democratic. Right, it was never properly a demos ruling the system. Right, not even under Pericles this technically happened. And if you understand what values drove the single individuals, their social extraction, how they would serve the polis in politics and at war, you understand immediately this is a completely different picture than a democracy or of our centuries. It's way more similar to, again, a Germanic Zippe plus comitatus, because let's be honest, also the hoplites in this sense have some aggregational sort of chivalric brotherhoods mentalities that bring them. And when I say chivalric, I really mean it, meaning that, as you know, in all Indo-European religions, even among peoples like the European ones that were largely sedentary at this point and had in the infantry their stronger arm, everybody was obsessed with the cult of the war horse. All the heroes are knights. And again, this incredibly late in time notion that we're looking at Republican and democratic realities akin to our own by essentially canceling the traditional legacy of all the systems is disturbing. And especially for the Spartans, this is probably the greatest mistake, because today we should have actually covered this in greater depth, but the same Spartan political system was heavily founded on the notion of the sacred character of their kings. If you're interested, I reference to the Spartans in those videos about sacred royalty, and we'll surely come back on them specifically. Also, the same concept that the hoplite phalanx was rooted in a sense of unity and equality among its members was not democratic, right? These people, as we've seen, were superior to the others. If you were a polis citizen, you were superior to the other people who weren't and who lived in the city. You were truly a racially superior individual. You were conceived as properly stemming from a better bunch that had the right to rule the inferior, all right? This is a radically ingrained mentality basically in every culture in the world, and that especially in these times is incredibly alive, right? Consequently, the Spartan military elevated way of life was considered as the pinnacle, right, as the closest to the heavens. And the other Hellenes were aware of this. I mean, if you read, again, Herodotus, you realize that the attitude of the other Greeks towards the Spartans was one of reverence exactly because of the maintenance of that lifestyle, right? It wasn't a scam. It wasn't a publicity. It wasn't, I don't know, a bias stemming from one author that once wrote something and out of context. Because this is literally also what that video about K and G. I didn't watch entirely, but I just said, how were the Spartans? Basically, they weren't even talking about warfare or religion, whatever. They were essentially looking at, oh, look, here it proves that there were some Spartans that were into crafts. Or did you know that Athens at some point was more militaristic than Sparta, that had an artistic and poetic production? I literally learned that in middle school, right? And how is it possible that this is like a myth buster? Like it's something that people must be taught. I mean, I understand that people are radically undereducated, ignorant as goats, but, to seriously pretend that these are our standards now already essentially normalizes lesser people. And this is absolutely abnormal, all right? And this is exactly what the Spartans and the other Greeks, as much as any other people at the time, deeply believed in. And if you don't understand this, it's a bit difficult for you even to talk about the Spartans in any minimally informed fashion. This egalitarianism had nothing to do with a lesser element. Right, you can't see this if you consider, of course, the Hellenic polis as the product of an erosion of a tyrannical, monarchical government. So with a sacred ruler, single sacred ruler that would have managed to control whoever was below. But taking that away, if you look at this establishment, especially in the Spartan case, you realize that they were following the same practice as an estate of superior people, just like the nobility does in general. And in this sense, they had a quite communitarian sense of control because they shared that. There wasn't much of even within the Spartiates, a pinnacle of tyranny. Yes, there were kings, there were more favored clans, absolutely. But in this sense, when you looked at these men fighting in a phalanx, side by side, living, training, fighting, dying together, you realize that was the bulk that controlled the thing. These are the guys who literally command other polis and that are superior to them, that the Athenians have to build an entire wall to prevent, sort of coming to harass the same Athenian outskirts, as the Athenian army does not want to face the Spartans in open field. This is straight sort of Peloponnesian War 101, right? How don't we see this? Right? How do we want to normalize this? How do we want to flatten or relativize this? This is not avoidable, right? So in this sense, when you look at these clans that, by the way, were also spurred to compete with other groups, because evidently they weren't even perceived as particularly threatening to one another in this broader political and social segmentation, you really see the same order issued by the mythical lawgiver Lycurgus, right? Physical prowess, resilience against hardship, scarcity, and harsh conditions became qualities not just of individuals, but of the collective. And this is the great step. Like if the Spartans just had been a bunch of brutes incapable of making war, it would have been just like, I don't know, any other sort of non-civilized continental tribe. This was something completely different. It's a civilization that, however, works on the same premises of that traditional aristocratic ethos. And that's why people can't afford to accept that the Spartans were what they were, because by accepting their superiority, they're accepting essentially an antithetical raison d'etre on the basis of which they They built their own entire worldview and evaluated themselves. It's not like an Athenian hoplite disregarded physical prowess, resilience against hardship, scarcity, and harsh conditions. Actually, these preceded the collective one as well for anybody. Because guess what? Life was pretty harsh back then. It's not like by being an Hellenic citizen, you were just a guy, walking across the agoras, watching temples, drinking wine, eating olives. You would have been heavily involved into the major political, military, and social issue of your community. You would have definitely been open to the idea of going to war, risking your life, killing people. It was one of your greatest and highest values. This is there for the Athenians. Again, in this sense, you're showing how similar the Spartans and the Athenians were. It's only in the actual military result and quality and performance that you can appreciate how the Spartan phalanx was the toughest, revered by everyone, the spearhead of the Hellenes at war on land. As we've seen, the power in which the hope of most of the free Greeks was reposed during the Persian invasion. So there is an obvious reason, and this has not been made up by historiography. By the way, I don't want to open again too many digressions on historiography, but if you read Hellenic historiography, aside from the fact that it's pretty vast, right? Even just sticking to the classical one, of course, and so loaded, replete with details, information, that first of all, you can understand all the complexity of it. And the fact that it's accurately describing an incredibly qualitative system, right? If a myth had been spread, this would have died immediately. Like this was not a system where literal citizens that heard of the stories, read of the stories, participating to the same wars that these were describing, etc., would have immediately checked the validity of. Right? It's not like, I don't know, a later Hellenistic historian wrote something about how that emperor, 200 years before had, I say Hellenistic at that point, almost in a Byzantine sense, would have felt in that moment, and so that becomes history, and people cite that because it's also easier. No. The classical Hellenic literature tells you incredibly coherent stories, right? Let's leave aside, Herodotus' giant ants and the memes that stem from that. But even in that case, actually, there is a dimension of distance, of faraway places, exotic marvels, etc., that still fit a greater interest of the Greeks that were quite otherwise informed about the nearbys. And so also in that case, it was a very sort of banal example, but you can find this also in medieval chronicles. They're incredibly accurate, practically in everything. Like the same reason why they were written. I mean, if you in a civic context where people literally participated to the magistracies, to the armies of the city, there is nothing wrong in it. Then they maybe start talking about the Khazars in the steppes and whatever, and the thousands of kilometers apart, and start saying there were armies of 200,000 men or whatever, and then it's BS, right? But in the merits of the individual information, that was definitely not the case. Bonds among comrades grew as deep as familial ties for every Spartan. They had already been the way freemen's clans had gone to war since ever, and so why stopping at this point? Only increasing the scale of this at a collective level in more orderly linear formations that the Spartans meticulously sort of trained for deploying properly in time, fast, orderly. Again, I made a video about the Spartan drill. We'll also talk about properly the Spartan training, which began in childhood, learning armed dances called Pyrrhic dances. Say the Romans had the same identical things. The Germans had the same identical things. This was normal for the time. There is no boundary between these peoples. They are the same Europe, sort of tribal at the end, because we're talking tribes. I mean, as you know, the Greeks had another term for that, but it's the same identical one. The Romans had tribes still in their electoral colleges and so on. that's where the system had sprung from. And we are talking 600 BC. I mean, this is are overwhelmingly archaic and primitive times. This dances not only built physical strength, but also instilled the rhythm and agility needed to maneuver cohesively in the phalanx, maintaining the pace, cohesion, order, formation. Archaeological evidence from the Menelaon shrine includes bronze tripods inscribed with dedications by young Spartiates dating to 600 BC, suggesting that these dances were part of religious festivals honoring martial prowess since ever. Again, there is not a moment in which Sparta began to do this as a separated system from the other. It had basically remained what the system had always been, and just further specializing, conferring more privileges to this establishment, capable of commanding, again, essentially the continental, the terrestrial warfare in Hellas, right? The dances, training, etc. were accompanied by music, with flute players ever present on the battlefield. The prolonged and arduous training was tinged with cruelty, leading Plutarch to note, of course it's a later source, but for the Spartans, battle was a welcome respite from their rigorous preparation, which, psychologically speaking, is also very spot on, because if you train, when you train, for a very long time for getting, eventually, where you want to get, you know that you're finally going over the top. So during World War I, it was basically the same thing, spending all the time in the trench. Aside from the bombardments, it was terrible psychologically. It was much better to feel hyped by adrenaline in the moment of the attack, for how scared you were in anticipation of that. But hell, at least it came, and so you have to stop worrying about it. The Spartans naturally were much more violent. Their treatment of the helots was pretty brutal. It's not like they were literally killing everybody, or they were so necessarily, abusive without any other purpose. This mechanism existed also in Athens. There's some military service performed on the frontier, on outposts, watchtowers, etc., that basically establishes these foreign garrisons in the countryside where nobody cared about, like at least in the fringes of the Athenian dominions, where these hoplites were some sort of lords who could abuse whoever was there, because simply they were the better people. And society was also just aligned not for this not to simply happen. Like helots of the lowest order would be normally brutalized, right? And of course there were different, youthly violence is still there, right? An idea of a let out for violence, especially in such a military expectant society, was necessary. It was the precondition for shaping your brain into to violence, to killing, to do something that you would have had to do virtually for a living, right? It's not like the Spartans were at war all the time, or that in fact that their society was fully militarized. Even the Spartiates were not really sort of professional soldiers. They were something like, I don't know, people receiving a non-commissioned officialty in comparison. These are not Roman legionaries. They're not Macedonian pizzatari. They live in a different way, which is also the one, again, of a bit of the tribe of the communal living. I remember that video about K and G that was basically just saying, but this idea of strict, harsh communal living, well, nobody really thought that the Spartans were primitive cavemen that lived in a place just smashing clubs on their slaves' heads, and then there was not a civilized Sparta, or again, art, music, poetry. Of course, some of these activities were frowned upon by the more authoritative elements of the system, but in every society there was this kind of segmentation between the lower element. I mean, think about the patricians and the plebeians in Rome, right? Except for the fact that at some point in the 4th century BC, this all became Roman to a degree of citizenry. But before that, in fact, the divide was much more rigid as well. And still, in fact, the Roman mentality is much more egoistic in this sense, because the chosen people here, transfigured by the patriciates, are also extracted from this lower element, and the Romans think and will succeed in doing that for the entire world. So a very different mentality from the Hellenes that literally thought that they had been installed in a place metaphysically to maintain that order no matter what. And in that sense, the Spartans were looked upon by the other Greeks not just because of their military prowess, but because of the mechanism that allowed for them to preserve that kind of militarized lifestyle in an otherwise non-professional military context that had been gradually loosening that sort of more warlike mentality of the Bronze Age. So this is why the Spartans were actually exceptional. And we know that just by result. It's striking because, again, when you realize that these poleis fought more or less all in the same way, there is a reason, even if a big one, if the Athenians at some point do not want to fight with the Spartans in open field for no reason, right? Which is also quite, meaningful because it's not like resources were infinite. It's not like, in fact, the same Athenians would have not been up to a fight. They would have not committed their citizenry into fighting against, and basically leaving the initiative in the interland to the Spartans, having to erect a wall to stop their raids. Hadn't there been probably a system that was up to fighting otherwise, and the Spartans were evidently that, and the Athenians do not show up. So how do you explain that? This is obviously a rhetorical question. It's not like I'm asking for someone to explain. This is ABC, classical Hellenic history. Excuse me, drink a little. For the rest, we have lead figurines from the Spartan sanctuary of Artemis Orthia depicting warriors in phalanx formation. We're in the mid-6th century BC, illustrating the emphasis on some broader synchronized movement in the Spartan military chain. It was, again, the mirroring of a higher way of life and of war that brought the Spartans under their leaders of divine blood, going back to the Olympus, touching on heaven by upholding that magnificent metaphysical display of imperium. All right. And if one does not appreciate this, has just to gigantize the Spartan military capacities and or sort of emasculate them as the sole options of the thing, well, you will not go anywhere, right, in the history of Europe and beyond. And again, I really now want to make a bit more about the Spartan religious implication of their political and military social system, because those would really explain a lot in the process. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.